Welcome to Guts and Guns.
I'm so glad you're joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for being here. We have a really great one today.
We really do, because we are pulling from some absolutely fascinating excerpts from a text called St. Patrick's Day, Irish Roots, American Celebration.
It's a fantastic source, really detailed.
And, our mission for this deep dive is, well, it's pretty ambitious. We are setting out to completely unravel basically everything you think you know about March 17th.
Right, because it is a mission that requires us to look past the modern spectacle. We really have to examine the underlying history here.
Exactly.
To truly understand this holiday, we have to treat it as a living artifact. We need to look at the people who carried these traditions across an ocean.
Right, the actual immigrants.
Yeah, and analyze how survival, prejudice, and, entirely new urban environments mutated those traditions into something completely unrecognizable to the ancestors who started them.
Which brings me to this sort of thought experiment I had. Imagine walking into a deeply quiet, solemn, candlelit cathedral.
Okay. Setting the scene.
Yeah. People are whispering, the atmosphere is intensely reflective, heads are bowed in prayer, and then suddenly, someone just kicks open the heavy wooden doors.
Oh, boy.
They blast a brass band, hand you a pair of novelty sunglasses, and throw a massive, glittery parade right down the center aisle.
That is quite the visual.
Right. But that complete, jarring whiplash, that total transformation of a quiet, sacred space into a massive, loud street party, that is the exact historical journey we are exploring for you today.
It really is the perfect analogy for what happened to March 17th over the course of a few centuries.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can understand what this holiday became when it hit American shores, we have to look at the shocking truth of its origins in Ireland.
Which surprises a lot of people.
Oh, I'll fully admit it surprised me.
Whoa.
I always assumed St. Patrick, the patron saint of Ireland, was born in Dublin or at least somewhere on the Emerald Isle.
You are definitely not alone in that assumption. But the historical record tells a very different story. The historical figure we actually call St. Patrick was born in Roman Britain in the late 4th century.
Which immediately scrambles the narrative. I mean, the ultimate icon of Irish identity was British.
He was. And his initial connection to Ireland wasn't as a missionary. It actually began with a profound trauma.
Right, the kidnapping.
Exactly. When he was just 16 years old, he was kidnapped by Irish raiders.
Just a teenager.
Yeah. Violently torn from his home in Britain, sold into slavery in Ireland, and he spent 6 brutal years basically tending sheep in total isolation in the wilderness.
The sources outline this incredible survival story, though, where he eventually escapes captivity, navigates his way back home, and reunites with his family.
It's a wild journey on its own.
But what I find so baffling is the next step. He secures his freedom, he becomes a priest, and then he makes the deliberate, conscious choice to go back to the very place he was enslaved.
Yeah, he returns to the exact people who held him captive. But this time as a missionary aiming to convert the pagan population to Christianity.
It's just a remarkable narrative of psychological resilience and, honestly, forgiveness.
Absolutely. And historically, the date we commemorate him, March 17th, it isn't his birthday.
Oh, right.
It is recognized as the date of his death, somewhere around 461 AD.
But, when a historical figure becomes that influential, the actual biography starts getting buried under, centuries of folklore.
Oh, definitely. The myth-making takes over.
Yeah, and the source material spends some time debunking these massive myths, like the famous story of St. Patrick standing on a hill and miraculously driving all the snakes out of Ireland.
Right, which the fossil record is aggressively clear on.
No snakes.
0. Snakes never existed in post-glacial Ireland. The Ice Age essentially wiped out any cold-blooded reptiles there.
And because it's an island, they couldn't just walk back.
Exactly. The geographical isolation meant that once the ice retreated, the snakes simply had no physical bridge to cross back over. So the legend is a metaphor.
For driving out pagan ideology.
Right, not actual reptiles.
He also supposedly used the 3-leaf shamrock to visually explain the Holy Trinity to the local population, which is a brilliant piece of marketing.
It is, but the historians note this detail was likely added to his legend much, much later.
Yeah. But the detail that made me do a complete double take in these sources is the original atmosphere of the holiday.
The vibe was very different.
So different. For centuries in Ireland, March 17th wasn't a raucous celebration. You'd go to church with your family in the morning and maybe have a nice, quiet feast in the afternoon.
It was profoundly religious and strictly observant.
And to enforce that solemnity, Irish laws actually mandated that all pubs remain legally closed on St. Patrick's Day.
Which sounds completely fake to modern ears.
I know, and that wasn't just some medieval decree either. That law was actively enforced all the way up until the 1970s.
It's wild.
That is like discovering that fireworks were legally banned on the 4th of July. It makes absolutely no sense based on how we celebrate it today.
What's fascinating here is how historical realities are so often completely overwritten by cultural mythology, especially when a culture gets displaced.
Yeah, when they migrate.
The real story of a resilient, formerly enslaved man returning to his captors was slowly overshadowed by magical fairy tales and, well, modern partying.
But if you're wondering how a dry, church-going day transformed into the loudest party of the year, we have to look geographically westward. Because the party did not start in Ireland.
No, it did not.
Which brings us to a massive transatlantic shift. The very first recorded St. Patrick's Day parades happened in North America.
Right, the sources point to St. Augustine, Florida, way back in 1601.
1601. And later you see Irish soldiers serving in the English military marching in Boston in 1737 and in New York City in 1762.
They were far from home, so marching was just a basic way to reconnect with their roots.
But those early military marches don't really explain the massive cultural juggernaut we see today. That transformation was born out of absolute tragedy, wasn't it?
It was. The turning point is the 1845 Irish potato famine. The sheer scale of that devastation cannot be overstated. A massive blight wiped out the primary food source for the island's poor.
Over 1 million people starved to death.
And millions more were forced to flee. So you have these impoverished, deeply traumatized Irish Catholics piling into coffin ships and immigrating to the United States, literally just to survive.
And imagine arriving in cities like Boston or New York under those horrific conditions, only to face a wall of intense hostility.
The reception was brutal.
The sources describe severe religious bigotry and rampant anti-immigrant sentiment. The "No Irish Need Apply" signs were plastered in shop windows everywhere.
They were pushed into the worst slums and relegated to the absolute bottom rung of American society.
So how do you go from being an actively despised underclass to, owning the city streets one day a year?
You organize.
Ah.
And this is where the genius of the American St. Patrick's Day parade really crystallizes.
Okay.
The Irish-American community started utilizing the parade not just to celebrate their heritage, but to actively demonstrate their sheer numbers.
Like a show of force.
Exactly. Think about how local 19th century political machines operated like Tammany Hall in New York.
Oh, right. The ward boss.
Right. Ward bosses needed votes to maintain their grip on the city. So when the Irish community organized a parade with tens of thousands of men marching in unison, they were sending a highly calculated message to the mayor and the political bosses.
I see the mechanism now. So the St. Patrick's Day parade wasn't a cultural import. It was practically born as an American civil rights march disguised as a celebration.
Yes, precisely.
They were showing the local government exactly how much voting power they possessed. Like, look at how many of us there are. If you want our votes, you need to give us jobs in the police department, the fire department, and public works.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is a textbook example of how marginalized immigrant groups historically utilize public spaces to force visibility.
Because they had no other platform.
Right. When you are denied a seat at the table, taking over the major thoroughfares of a city for one day a year demands respect. It is a brilliant strategy to consolidate political power in a hostile new home.
That reframes those old parade photos entirely for me.
Mm-hmm.
They aren't just having fun, they are flexing their political muscle.
And over the decades, the strategy absolutely worked.
Yeah, Irish Americans gained political power, they established themselves in the middle class, and the holiday assimilated into the broader culture.
The sources highlight 1948 as the ultimate seal of approval.
Oh, when President Harry Truman attended the parade.
Right, in New York City. Having the President of the United States show up essentially signals that your marginalized immigrant march is now a mainstream American institution.
The transition from the fringes to the center of political power is totally complete at that point.
Exactly.
But navigating that new American environment wasn't just about political power, It was about literal daily survival.
Finding enough to eat.
Yes, and that survival heavily influenced what they could afford to put on their dinner tables. Let's talk about the menu, because assimilation changed their food just as radically as it changed their parades.
Food history is always so revealing. If you ask anyone today what the traditional St. Patrick's Day meal is, they will instantly say corned beef and cabbage.
Without hesitation. But the sources reveal that if you went back in time and asked for corned beef and cabbage in 18th century Ireland, you would get completely blank stares.
Total confusion, because the concept of slaughtering a cow for a feast day was economically absurd for the average Irish citizen.
Cows were too valuable.
Right. In historical Ireland, cattle were kept for their milk. They functioned as a primary indicator of wealth. You did not eat your wealth.
The actual traditional feast meat back home is a type of cured pork. The sources call it Irish bacon.
Yeah, something closer to what we'd call Canadian bacon today.
Right. And you'd serve that with a side of potatoes. So how do we get from cured pork to corned beef?
We have to look at the living conditions in 19th century American cities. When those impoverished Irish immigrants arrived in places like New York's Lower East Side, they went to local markets hoping to buy their traditional pork.
Makes sense.
But they quickly discovered that in the urban United States, pork was surprisingly expensive. It was completely out of their budget.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Think about the geography of those slums.
Yeah.
They were incredibly densely packed. The Irish immigrants were living shoulder to shoulder with newly arriving Jewish immigrants from Eastern and Central Europe.
Right.
And the Irish start noticing what the Jewish butchers are doing in the local delis.
They discover salt-cured brisket,
Cool.
corned beef.
And the mechanism behind this swap makes perfect sense when you look at it. The salt curing process the Jewish delis used on the beef yielded a taste and texture remarkably similar to the cured Irish bacon back home.
It hit the same flavor profile.
Exactly. And most importantly, brisket was an incredibly cheap, tough cut of meat. So the Irish immigrants substitute the expensive pork for the cheap Jewish corned beef.
And they pair it with cabbage.
Right, because cabbage was the absolute cheapest vegetable they could find instead of potatoes. And boom, an iconic American tradition is born purely out of economic necessity.
It highlights a beautiful sociological reality.
It really does.
We tend to view traditions as these pure, unchanging monoliths handed down from ancient history. But the reality is that the shared proximity of impoverished immigrant groups in urban slums historically breeds incredible cultural innovation.
People just share what they have.
They look what their neighbors are doing, they substitute what they cannot afford, and in the process, they create entirely new shared traditions.
The most famous Irish dish in America is deeply, inextricably indebted to Jewish deli culture. It is literally the ultimate early American fusion cuisine.
It really forces you to redefine what authenticity means in the context of an immigrant nation.
So necessity forced them to change their traditional food. But assimilation didn't just change what they put on their plates, it completely warped the visual markers of their identity.
Oh, absolutely.
Take the color green. If you're listening to this and you've ever been pinched by a coworker for forgetting to wear a green shirt on March 17th, you probably assume green has been the official color of St. Patrick's since the dawn of time.
Not even close.
No.
For centuries, the color associated with the saint was actually a light, pale shade known historically as St. Patrick's blue.
Which is wild. The idea of a pale blue St. Patrick's Day just feels deeply wrong to modernize.
It does.
So what drives the shift to neon emerald?
Well, the shift involves geography, folklore, and eventually violent political rebellion.
Okay, break that down.
Geographically, Ireland is famously lush, earning the Emerald Isle moniker. You also have the folklore of the green shamrock, of course. But the color truly solidified as the ultimate symbol of Irish identity during the Irish Rebellion of 1798.
And this is where wearing a color transitions from a fashion choice to an act of treason, basically.
Precisely. The Irish were rising up against British rule. The British uniforms were famously red, so the Irish rebels adopted green as their contrasting color.
Right.
Wearing green clovers in your lapel, or singing the famous rebellion ballad, The Wearing of the Green, became a fierce, defiant symbol of Irish patriotism. It was a visual declaration of independence.
So wearing green actually started as a highly dangerous political statement.
It did.
But today, if you forget to wear green in America, you don't face political arrest. You face the threat of getting pinched by your friends.
Which is another detail the sources completely tear apart.
Yes, the pinching tradition is a 100% American invention.
It is a complete fabrication based on a frankly massive misunderstanding of leprechaun lore.
The American logic goes like this. Leprechauns are highly mischievous fairies who love to randomly pinch people. But if you wear green clothing, it supposedly acts as an invisibility cloak against them.
Like camouflage.
Right. The fairy simply can't see you. So if you don't wear green, you are fully visible. Your friends pinch you as a helpful reminder that you're an open target for a fairy attack.
It's such a bizarre mutation of Celtic mythology.
It really is. But if we really want to examine the absolute extreme of how far America took the color green, we have to talk about the mechanics of what happens in Chicago.
The dyeing of the Chicago River is arguably the most uniquely American spectacle on the holiday calendar.
The entire river running through downtown Chicago is turned a brilliant, glowing shade of emerald green.
It looks radioactive.
It does. If you didn't know the history, you'd assume this was some ancient Celtic water ritual imported from the old country. But the actual origin story from the sources is wonderfully absurd.
It started in 1962 with a man named Stephen Bailey.
Who, it should be noted, was not a Celtic druid.
No, he was the politically connected head of the Chicago Plumbers Union.
And his union was trying to solve a very unglamorous problem.
Oh.
They were tracing illegal raw sewage leaks that were dumping straight into the river system.
Right.
To track exactly where the sewage was coming from, the plumbers poured an incredibly bright fluorescent green oil-based dye into the pipes. If they saw that glowing green sludge empty into the river, they knew they had found a leaking pipe.
Makes sense for plumbing.
Yeah. So Stephen Bailey sees a plumber walk into the union hall with his overalls absolutely covered in this glowing green dye. And a light bulb goes off.
It is a staggering leap of logic. He looks at vividly marked raw sewage dye and thinks, let's make that a holiday centerpiece.
But here's the crazy part about the mechanics of 1960s Chicago politics. Because he was a powerful union boss, he actually had the clout to just do it.
Yeah, he didn't need a decade of environmental impact study.
No. He just had his guys dump 100 pounds of this toxic plumbing dye directly into the Chicago River.
Which is terrifying from a modern ecological standpoint.
Completely terrifying. The sources note that thankfully, by 1966, environmentalists intervened.
Thank goodness.
Yeah. They realized that dumping massive amounts of oil-based fluorescent dye into a major waterway was a terrible idea, so they forced a switch to a secret vegetable-based dye that is actually safe for the fish.
This raises an important question, though, about the true cost of commercialization.
How so?
Well, the American immigrant experience successfully mainstreamed St. Patrick's Day. It took a deeply marginalized, starving population and put them at the absolute center of the cultural calendar.
Right.
But in that process of mainstreaming, it systematically replaced the holiday's solemn religious origins and its serious political roots with lighthearted, secular spectacle.
Yeah. The desperate struggle for civil rights was replaced by the threat of a leprechaun pinch.
It is the ultimate double-edged sword of assimilation. You gain universal acceptance, but you lose the gravity of your own history.
The original meaning gets buried under the celebration.
Exactly. It becomes a party for everyone, regardless of their background, but the mechanisms of survival that built the holiday are forgotten.
Which brings us right back to you, listening to this deep dive. Think about the incredible, sprawling journey we've just unpacked today.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. The next time you sit down to a plate of corned beef, or you dodge a pinch at the office, or you watch a parade march down your local main street, realize that you aren't just participating in some ancient Celtic lore.
Not at all.
You are participating in a living history of American survival. You're tasting the reality of 19th century immigrant slums where Irish and Jewish neighbors shared what they had.
Yeah.
You're seeing the echoes of a brilliant political strategy designed to force a hostile local government to pay attention to a starving people. You are looking at cultural blending in real time.
And that evolutionary process hasn't stopped, which leaves us with a fascinating thought to mull over.
Ooh, let's hear it.
Well, we've seen how drastically St. Patrick's Day mutated over the last 150 years, morphing from a quiet Irish feast into a massive multicultural American spectacle purely because of demographic shifts and neighborhood blending.
Right.
So what will this holiday look like a century from now?
Oh, wow.
As new waves of immigrants from all around the world continue to settle in these exact same American cities, adding their own cultural flavors to the melting pot, what entirely new traditions will be unknowingly added to St. Patrick's Day by the year 2126.
That is such a cool concept. Will the food change again?
The holiday has never been static, so it is guaranteed to keep evolving.
It really makes you wonder what kind of fusion cuisine is currently bubbling up in a neighborhood somewhere, just waiting to become the new traditional St. Patrick's Day meal 100 years from now.
Exactly.
It just goes to show you never know when the quiet cathedral of history is going to throw open its doors and completely surprise you. Thank you so much for exploring these incredible sources with us today.
It's been a real pleasure to break it all down. Keep looking closer at the traditions around you.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Tune in again.